Stephanie, thank you, and thank Malaprops for hosting us tonight. This pandemic has been especially cruel to many of our small businesses, and I simply cannot imagine Asheville without Malaprops. So, the businesses that we love will continue to struggle until we all feel like it's safe to be able to go out again. So please consider going to Malaprop's website and buy a book or make a donation. And thank you for considering that. And thank you to each and every one of you for all of the sacrifices that you have made to keep us safe. I know we're all tired of this pandemic, but I also know that you have saved countless lives. And finally, I want to thank you for being here tonight and for giving me the privilege of representing you in the North Carolina Senate this past seven years. It's been truly the honor and privilege of a lifetime. And one of the best things about this job is that it gives me the opportunity to work with some incredible people, smart, dedicated, passionate people who deeply care about the welfare of North Carolina. And at the very top of that list for me is our speaker tonight. Professor Nichol is a superhero. He is an insightful writer, so I urge you to buy his books. And he is an inspirational speaker, which you will no doubt figure out for yourself this evening. But his superpower is his laser vision ability to recognize injustice and couple that with his strength and courage to speak truth to power. As president of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, his defense of freedom of speech cost him his job. But that brought him back to the University of North Carolina, where he had previously served as the dean of the law school and where he became a director of the UNC Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity, affectionately known as the Poverty Center. And as director of the Poverty Center, he was an outspoken critic of the General Assembly. But rather than address the injustices that Professor Nichol so clearly called out in his writing, the General Assembly found it easier to just close the Poverty Center. But fortunately for us, he remains undaunted and continues to write and speak truth to power. And he has won numerous awards and honors for that work. But rather than list them here, I would much rather you had more time to hear from him. So it is with enormous pleasure that I introduce to you Professor Gene Nichol.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Terry. That is far more kind than I deserve. Let me just say that. I am delighted to be here, be part of this program. I love and miss Asheville. Malaprops is my favorite bookstore in North Carolina, and I'm spending a lot of time one way or another in connection with bookstores. I love to just come there and hang out for long periods of time. It sort of sets you straight to sit in the building. So I'm very grateful that you guys would host this. Let me say a word about your senator, who we have just heard from. I was thrilled, maybe 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when I first started getting to know Terry. Thrilled that she sacrificed enough to take on the life of a public servant in North Carolina to become your senator. She is, I think, the best member in the Senate. She is a great hope for the Democratic Party, which is a hope necessary to achieve our own decency in North Carolina. So I know that she has a wide world of fans and acolytes, but none bigger than me, literally and figuratively, probably. And she's got a cadre of folks here in Orange County who are her disciples. So Terry, thanks very much for joining this. I wrote Indecent Assembly for two reasons. First, the work of the Republican General Assembly in the last decade has received a lot of attention, actually, here and around the country, but it's almost always about one particular piece, one outrage, one sort of corner of the broad project of the legislature. It's about voting or gerrymandering or race or HB2. What I think of as the day-to-day accretions of the Republican General Assembly. Not much study has focused on the agenda of the General Assembly, broadly speaking, across the board. And let me just say, when you put it together, chapter by chapter, it's an astonishing record. I started studying it as a whole maybe 18 months ago, and I've always been probably among its critics, but I would suggest you study it the whole, you sort of move from the merely pissed off to the something worse. It's an astonishing agenda. So first, it's good to see it in, I thought, in one place, in brief language. Second, and more important though, is what they're doing. I'm a constitutional lawyer by trade. Our Constitution assumes that there's going to be always a lot of give and take in our politics. There'll be liberals and conservatives, there'll be environmentalists, economists, and the like. But it also assumes that there are certain givens which remain over time, regardless of who's in power and the structures of the moment, that we honor and secure no matter what political party holds sway, kind of the foundations of our structures of government, the political combat, democracy, judicial review, separation of powers, checks and balances, racial and political equality, the rule of law. These folks, to be candid, have sundered that political compact. What constitutional government means in the United States and in North Carolina, which makes this not only a political battle, but a battle over what we are, what we claim to be, what sort of society we are to become. The list of transgressions, which I go through, is a long one. It's breathtaking and foundation destroying. The North Carolina General Assembly has, since 2011, first enacted a bold and historically stunning agenda to diminish the political and judicial and dignitary rights of African Americans. The program has been launched without embarrassment from all white Republican House and Senate caucuses. They have given us redistricting plans held to be the largest racial gerrymanders ever presented to an American court. They've given us intentionally biased, the court said, surgically created voter ID laws meant to disenfranchise African Americans, ballot access limitations, polling place restrictions, all aimed at re-embracing Jim Crow electoral schemes. They repealed the groundbreaking Racial Justice Act, curtailed state discrimination actions based on race, increased, as you know, school segregation, and demanded idolatrous protection for Confederate statues. This White People's Party, or all white caucus, has sought to build a bridge in North Carolina to 1953. They've offered similar treatment to poor Tar Heels. You know this story. 500,000 low-income citizens have been denied health care through a long-standing and continuing refusal to expand Medicaid, costing the state billions of dollars and thousands of lives each year. Republican lawmakers have initiated the largest cut to a state unemployment compensation program in American history. They made North Carolina the only state ever to cancel its earned income tax credit, raising the tax bills of poor working families, making about $35,000 a year. They have kicked thousands of poor kids off of food stamps, though the federal government pays the whole fare. They abolished our statewide appropriation for legal aid. They have sharply cut child care subsidies. The list actually of targeting poor people is much longer. I think it reflects the most aggressive war against poor people seen in an American state for a half century. They have also pushed frontiers in the denials of human dignity to LGBT Tar Heels through animus-driven constitutional amendments, licenses to discriminate in government services, and of course, our internationally denounced bathroom regulations. They have sought to humiliate and endanger the vulnerable. Legislators have declared thousands of our fellow citizens officially diminished through these actions. The New York Times refers to it as, quote, North Carolina's pioneering work in bigotry. Lawmakers have also arrogantly violated the personal liberty, the constitutional privacy, and bodily integrity of North Carolina women. They not only passed an array of impermissibly restrictive abortion laws, apt to do more, but they enacted a shocking mandatory sonogram law, which enlisted a woman's body, her physician, and her pocketbook in a coercive campaign to intimidate her from the exercise of her constitutional rights. They required doctors under this statute to mouth the state-mandated consent script like Stalinist apparatchiks, contrary to the doctor's perceptions of the best interests of their patients. They also have systematically moved to diminish and maybe eventually dismantle the public schools through teacher and teaching assistant layoffs, the elimination of tenure, the expansion of charter schools, gigantic investments in utterly unaccountable and discriminatory private school vouchers, the creation of an absurd and stigmatizing A through F school grading system, the adoption of achievement school districts. The General Assembly has worked, frankly put, to lay waste to traditional public schools. Doors have been widely opened to the degradation of the environment and natural resources. Lawmakers limited research on climate change, embraced fracking and offshore drilling, crushed funding for state parks and environmental enforcement, repealed state rules more protective than their federal counterparts, and as you know, preempted various forms of local environmental regulation. They have overtly protected the wealthy and the powerful from even the traditional legal rights of the marginalized through gag laws and limitations on nuisance actions. They have also unleashed an unforeseen assault on the independence of the North Carolina court system. The list here is long. They ended public funding of judicial campaigns, reintroduced partisan judges' races, curbed jurisdiction in constitutional cases, reviewing their own laws, intervened by statute to try and ensure the election of a Republican Supreme Court incumbent. They altered the size of the Court of Appeals for partisan purposes, temporarily eliminated judicial primaries in hopes of helping Republican judges, sought to reduce gubernatorial appointment powers, threatened all state judges with 2-year terms, the shortest in the country, and introduced, as you'll recall, a constitutional amendment to secure judicial appointment for themselves. Republican lawmakers have found independent judicial review to be a troublesome impediment, so they've tried to abolish it. They have shown themselves to be potent enemies of the rule of law. And as if attacking judicial independence and the rule of law wasn't enough, the General Assembly has moved to thwart democracy itself. Lawmakers enacted the most ambitious voter suppression law and the most extreme political gerrymanders in modern American history. They've overturned city and county elections won by Democrats with sore loser laws through redistricting. They diminished the powers of the governor and the attorney general because Republicans lost the elections. As one national commentator put it, what is happening in North Carolina is an extraordinarily disturbing legislative coup, the kind of thing one might expect to see in Venezuela, not in the United States. And finally, in an effort to conceal their crusade against equality and democracy, the General Assembly has repeatedly abandoned truth itself. And that's not my opinion or just my opinion, but it's the frequent explicit finding of state and federal courts in reviewing legislation. Lying about legislative motivation defeats the possibility of deliberative discourse and demands that reviewing courts label our lawmakers as effective perjurers. It also reveals an inexcusable cynicism about democratic power and an absence of character that renders them unfit for office. It is possible to characterize these assaults on equality and democracy as radical or extreme or even as ultra-conservative, I suppose, which Republicans probably think they are. But the General Assembly's war on constitutional norms is actually a rejection of the structures and the foundational premises of the American experiment itself. They don't reflect the normal give and take of traditional politics. They challenge the foundations or the fundaments of our premises of government. I've long been taken with that word, fundament. It means broadly the basic principle, the underlying foundation or theory of a system. But it can also suggest a base or foundation, especially of a building, the fundaments upon which we have built. Foundations of governance, like judicial independence and the rule of law and separation of powers, have literally taken us centuries to develop and to secure. Casting them out in a temporary craving for power mocks our history and the bold legacy of our forebears. It breaks the most important promises we have made to one another as a people. A rejection of our fundaments is more serious business than merely being careless or mistaken or hyperzealous or simply wrong. It's more scornful of our story, our meaning, more contrary to the red, white, and blue. It is, not to put too fine a point on it, profoundly unpatriotic. So that means that the political battle now being waged this very month in North Carolina is not only brutal, it's defining. The stakes are larger than mere ideological ascendancy. They touch our character as a people. Republican leaders don't campaign as crusaders for an altered vision of American constitutional government, but that platform is increasingly what they carry out, regardless of what they say. So the political war in North Carolina is about more than politics. It's about our promises as a commonwealth. It is about our compact itself, our character as a people. Finally, it's a struggle for our own decency. Robert Kennedy said at Berkeley in 1966, "The future belongs to those who can blend reason, passion, and courage in a personal commitment to the ideals and enterprises of the American democracy." What was for Kennedy a description of the world he saw unfolding around him has become for us a manifesto and a prayer, and even this very month, a literal call to arms. So I'll stop there. We can open it up for questions or however we're going to do this, but I appreciate you letting me have in a few minutes. Thanks, Terry.
So thank you again to both of you, and thank you so much for that, Gene. I want to remind folks to go ahead and post their questions in the Q&A, and also remind folks of one other thing that I forgot to mention before. My colleague Patricia Furnish is on the call, and she is posting links in the chat. So do take a look at the chat as well. We'll ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, but go over to the chat button as well, and you'll see links there to books and to the websites for Gene Nichol and Terry Van Duyn. And as we go, other helpful information as well that you can have ready links to. So you can take a look at the chat there. And do go ahead and post any questions you have. And when you do post a question, just let us know who it's for. Both Gene and Terry will answer questions this evening. And so when you type in your question, just let us know who the question is for. And I actually have a question to start with, and I think you can both address this if you like. Gene, you mentioned when you were speaking gerrymandering and redistricting as a form of sore losership in certain regards. And so I wonder if you could speak a bit to the present and future of independent or nonpartisan redistricting.
Well, one hopes it has a bright future. It's had a lousy past in North Carolina. And by lousy past, I mean, I can remember making presentations 2 decades ago when I was a young law professor new to North Carolina, making presentations to Democrats who were then in control, trying to talk them into independent redistricting. Because the truth of it is, it doesn't work to have the folks who are drawing the districts be the direct beneficiaries of those etchings. It's a literal built-in conflict of interest. And Democrats weren't much interested in reform when they were controlling the legislature. But this has to be said, it's not really a sort of jot for jot notion. We redistrict now because of computer expertise in ways that simply could not have been done before this. We have reached levels of cheating which are astonishing and can mean literally that the democratic notion of government by majority can be threatened, is threatened, and threatened for the long haul. So we need independent redistricting strongly. I do think that the chances are, this is a good time historically for it. If Republicans maintain control in the legislature, there will be, of course, no chance for it. But if Democrats prevail, we're in one of those windows of time where I think if folks are to be candid, neither side knows who's going to gain control for the longer course. That's the moment in which you can strike, it seems to me, and perhaps get independent redistricting. So I would say this, if Republicans win, there is no chance that will occur. It's also true, I'm trying to say, that if Republicans win in this electoral cycle, maintain control of both houses. And it sounds exaggerated, but we're going to have so much destruction done to democratic norms that it will take generations to pick up the pieces. But this might be the magic moment for independent redistricting, which has worked in an array of states. I was in Colorado before I came here, was dean of the law school there, and was on an independent redistricting commission, which Colorado had by initiative process, which worked quite well. And so I hope that that's in our future. Terry knows more than I do. So Terry, what's your answer?
Well, I would just like to give folks an example of how effective partisan gerrymandering can be. When Republicans took over in 2010 and had the ability to draw districts, the next election for Congress in 2012, if you look at all of the votes cast for Congress, 60% of them went to Democratic candidates, but Republicans got 70% of the votes. So that created a congressional delegation that was not representative of the voters. So this is a very big deal. And I agree with Professor Nichol. Democrats have suffered under that. I can remember as a member of Common Cause before I was a senator, coming to the legislature every year and sitting down with my predecessor, Senator Nesbitt. And he'd sit back in his seat and he'd say, Terry, Democrats draw great districts. But now we've had a taste of what it feels like to just not have competitive districts. And what I have seen, even in my own caucus, is that it creates safe districts, and safe representatives in safe districts don't have the same incentive to be accountable to their voters. And so it affects how they do their job. But I also had the opportunity to sit down with independent commissioners, independent districting commissioners from California. And they have kind of a complicated system, but it is full of transparency and citizen input. And one of the things that they saw, which I thought was amazing, was they saw voter participation as high as 80%. That is unheard of. And so it tells you that if people think their votes count, they're more likely to get engaged. And isn't that really what we all want? And so I think that if Democrats take over the General Assembly, it will be by a fairly slim margin. And because of the demographic changes that are happening in North Carolina, there'll be a lot of uncertainty about the next census. And so I think it is a unique opportunity, and most of my Democratic colleagues are on record as being willing to support independent redistricting. So I am very hopeful that we'll be able to do that.
And Terry, could I just add on that we have had a decade under a regime which is so amazing a set of gerrymanders. It has been declared unconstitutional, first as racial gerrymanders, then as political gerrymanders, time after time after time by federal courts and then state courts. And then at each point, the legislature has dragged its feet, saying, well, we can't really give a remedy to that constitutional violation because we're too close to elections and the like, until something occurred in North Carolina that I've, as a constitutional lawyer, never seen before. You had both the Fourth Circuit and then a state tribunal in Raleigh ruled that this was such an extreme violation of the norms of the Constitution that it broke the bonds between a legislature and its citizenry, and broke the notion of consent of the governed. Now, the courts didn't know what to do about that. They entertained arguments about whether the product of the legislature ought to be rejected as a whole, but which would be an extreme remedy. But I've never seen a court say, this has been so extreme a set of abuses that it really has broken the legitimacy of the legislature as a governing body by severing the ties through consent of the government.
Well said. I think Justice Kagan's dissent in was almost tracked exactly what you're saying. When she said, yeah, it might be difficult to measure these things, and maybe but nevertheless, when it is so extreme that you cannot deny it, then we need to do something about it. And that gave me hope as well.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think that's such an important issue. The fact that we, and gerrymandering has sort of always been with us, but the extent, as you've been speaking about, seems so extreme in more recent years. And I know, in even looking at, my own district at one point on a map, and just kind of scratching my head about how it was drawn, and still voting, of course, because I think that's essential, and that we need to vote, and that our votes do matter, but also knowing that this was a tool that had been used to make it so that people just did not have to worry very much about actually competing, or actually, as you said, being held accountable.
Well, I have a map that I used to carry around everywhere on my iPad, and it was a map of Senator Blue's district, and it was colored to demonstrate the degree of African American population, and you could see how every weird outcropping in that map in that district was to grab more African Americans and pack them into as few districts as possible. So yes, those African Americans maybe had safe seats, but their influence in the General Assembly was diluted because they were limited to those districts. Right. And in a proportion that far exceeded their ability to be elected.
Right, and that's the key thing is how it dilutes voters' power, what could be their power to again hold elected officials accountable.
And I'll say, that the effort to dilute the voice of the people, I have seen that extend since I've been in the General Assembly. We do not have meaningful committee meetings anymore. And you see, they use a process called a PCS. That's a proposed committee substitute. I'm getting kind of wonky here. Instead of going through the normal, what you learn in junior high about how a bill becomes a law, they take a bill that's already passed, maybe in the House, and they stuff it with something completely different in the Senate. It goes back to the House. The House doesn't get to amend it. They don't get to have a committee meeting. They just get to vote up or down. And that cuts people out of the process. If they can't come to committee, because they can't speak on the floor, if they don't have the opportunity to come to committee, then we never get an opportunity to hear from them. And that happened the last budget we did in the short session, last session. They took a 600-page document and dropped it into a bill that had already passed both the House and the Senate. That's called the Conference Committee report. And what that means is by the time I got to see it, it had already been voted on. And so I just got to say, well, yeah, I agree or disagree with the changes. There was no debate. There was no ability to amend. And most importantly, there was no opportunity for the people I represent to call me up or come to Raleigh and say, you are missing something here and this has to be fixed. And when it's the most important piece of legislation we do the whole year, that's wrong and that needs to end.
It's also the process which gave us the motorcycle abortion.
Yes, that's an even better example because it's so visual. We had a motorcycle safety bill and we replaced it with an abortion bill.
Right.
And almost in the dead of night.
Right. Stephanie, can I add one thing to this? Because we can look at sophisticated denials of process and changes in the gerrymandering skills and arts, but it's people in North Carolina are not familiar as much as I would have thought they would be with a pretty stunning and direct violation of what we all say we stand for. And that is, for a decade now, virtually a decade, we've had large Republican majorities in both houses. Fortunately now not veto proof, but large majorities. Republicans go into their caucuses to propose the laws which become our statutes after working their way through the process. Those caucuses are all white gatherings. There are no people of color. There are no Black people there. North Carolina is 23% African American, about 40% people of color. The General Assembly caucuses, which create our rules, are all white, like a white people's party from a century ago. And they pass statute after statute, which targets the interests of African Americans and their status. Now, I think most North Carolinians, when I talk about this on the stump, they're shocked by that. They're surprised by it. You would think that we would know of it, but we typically don't. I get sort of warned about things I talk about sometimes, and I've been told that it's extremely rude and unmannerly to mention the racial makeup of the Republican caucus of the North Carolina General Assembly, which I've said means this. It's not rude to be a white people's party. It's rude to mention that we have a white people's party. I think the great bulk of North Carolinians would be horrified by that notion, but it's what we've had in place for almost a decade now, trying to out Alabama, or out Mississippi, and it's only going to be defeated if we reject it with great energy at the polls. No one's going to change folks' minds or sweet talk the opposition here into becoming a diverse institution. It's humiliating as well as violative of everything that we stand for to acknowledge that our laws are produced in a white people's caucus for the people of North Carolina.
Yes, and I calling out the problem doesn't cause the problem, and so I think there, we often encounter this reflex of taking offense at having something that you've done or said being labeled as racist when something that you've done or said has been labeled as racist, instead of looking at why that label applies. So calling it a white people's caucus because it is in fact entirely white, and recognizing that representation matters, and looking at the methods that have been used, if they weren't intentionally about inflicting racial injustice, they sure as heck had that result.
Right.
Right. So it seems like if that had happened accidentally, that would be an accident you'd want to correct.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to make that claim.
Right. And even setting race aside, which you shouldn't, but even setting race aside, it would be like if the Buncombe County Board of Commissioners called a meeting behind closed, locked, guarded doors and only let the Democrats in, and then came up with the entire agenda for that meeting, and then convened the public meeting and just gave the Republicans on the Board of Commissioners the right to say yes or no, no other discussion. And that's what's happening in the General Assembly.
Yeah.
It's a violation, I think, of the open meetings law. I really don't know how they get away with it.
Well, and it's challenging to think of any sort of representative government working this way without actual representation.
And then people think their votes don't matter because they don't have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't matter in that sense.
Right.
But I'm here to say, please vote.
Yes.
Because here's the thing, and I had the pleasure of speaking to Carol Anderson, who wrote One Person, No Vote, when that book came out originally a couple years ago. And the thing that I took away from listening to her, and I want to go ahead and just, if you don't mind, put in a plug for that book, actually, if you haven't read it or familiar with it. One Person, No Vote speaks just very plainly to voter suppression, which is often race-based. We need to be real about that. But the thing that I walked away with, and that I think is so important to remember, because it is frustrating as a voter to feel like your vote doesn't matter. If your vote really didn't matter, no one would be trying to stop you.
Right.
And people are, in fact, trying to stop
There
you.
are a couple of questions.
Yes. So
right.
I've got, yes. So I want to start with the first one was, does North Carolina have a citizen initiative process? So that could be used to set up an independent redistricting process.
Yeah.
No, we do not.
No.
Unfortunately, so it's incumbent on the legislature to change the law.
Right. And so it would be nice if we had that tool. I mentioned that I was out in Colorado and that they have an independent redistricting commission, which works pretty well. They have it because they have the initiative process.
Same in California.
And that's how things get rolling. When you realize that the legislature is going to have frequently a conflict of interest and not produce the statutes. Let me say this too, relevant to that. I've mentioned one of the great outrages of the last decade, which is the failure to expand Medicaid. If there are now there are 39 states which have expanded Medicaid, including a whole lot that are led by Republicans, and now an array of states which have done it through the initiative or the referendum process, through a vote of the people, unable to get in those instances, Republican legislators to change their position. We don't have the initiative, and we're not apt to get a referendum from the legislature because they're apparently uninterested in the position of the people of North Carolina, who very strongly support expansion of Medicaid. And I would just remind you, it's not as if those characters aren't willing to put all kinds of things on the ballot. Last election, we had 5 of them, I think, including hunting rights and the like. So I think they'll let us vote about whether we want to expand Medicaid if they're actually interested in the position of the people of North Carolina.
So we have another question from the audience, actually the same audience members who are asking about money influence. Specifically, is Koch and other outside money that helped Republicans take control of the legislature still influencing policies in North Carolina?
And well, do you want to start with that, Terry, or I'm glad to add a word? But
I'm happy to hear your perspective on this.
I think that the influence of money has a powerful and potent effect on the legislative process in North Carolina, both sort of through the world famous Koch brothers, but we have our local version as well. Art Pope, one of the soulmates of the Koch brothers, using dollars, using in his case money from department stores, which are, well, appeal to low-income folks, we should say, and then use the income from those stores to seek results in the legislature which crush the fortunes of poor people who are his customers or clients otherwise. But we have a potent war on poor people in North Carolina, which has a reciprocal side, and that is we pass statute after statute which takes away the interest, the economic interest of low-income folks in order to give money, remarkable sums of money, to those at the very top of the economic pecking order. So in North Carolina, it's seen as a good investment in the Republican Party to salt the political process through the influence of dollars, and that it's a good return on investment, because if you donate a few $100,000 to the process, you will get millions in return. It's just at war with the idea of a democracy.
And we have seen corporate taxes in the 7 years that I've been in the General Assembly. We've cut corporate taxes every single year. The proof is in the pudding.
And Patricia has again been posting links in chat that are great references, and mentions another book by Jane Mayer, Dark Money.
Yes.
Which came out a few years ago and speaks specifically to that, to the role that money plays in politics, and not just in elections, but ongoing. And
this book also talks about Art Pope's work in North Carolina. So it's
yeah, specifically,
but it has a we have our own localized chapter.
right.
Senator Whitehouse, during the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, brought out the influence of dark money in judicial deliberations, which was something I thought I was fairly up on this stuff. I had read the Dark Money book, but yeah, funding amicus briefs,
Right.
and spending millions of dollars.
Funding the operation of the Federalist Society, who then named Trump administration appointees, like the Bush administration appointees, to the federal courts for lifetime terms. There's a lot that could be said about the United States Supreme Court this very week, as we look like we're going to proceed to add a member of the court who will not only endanger the Affordable Care Act and the right to choose and the rights of LGBT Americans, but who will work a broader agenda consistent with what you've just asked about, Stephanie, which is meant to assure that the rights of wealth submerge the rights of democracy. That's a way of describing it. We want to make sure that money overcomes democratic participation. And I doubt that our new justice would claim that that's a big part of her goal, but it is part of the agenda that she brings with her. When it's 6-3 in the United States Supreme Court, we can be sure that that institution will return to what has been its long-standing traditional role of protecting the interests of wealthy people against democracy, and we will be a generation recovering from it.
Well, and I'll just note for those who haven't taken a look at the book yet or read the information about it, that there's a preface by Reverend William Barber. And so I just want to direct people who might be interested in, working on some of these issues in some fashion to check out the Poor People's Campaign. Right. And many people, I think, know Reverend Barber, who made, national news for the Moral Monday movement, and not him alone. He wouldn't want to take sole credit, I'm sure, but is probably the best known name, and is now part of the new Poor People's Campaign, which is it's nonpartisan, and it is intersectional. And so hopefully you won't mind me putting a plug in for that as well.
Yeah. You also did a very generous introduction of the book.
Yeah.
But let me say this: there's no stronger indication, an example of the fact that every person's activism counts than the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina. It hasn't completely won the day, but it has changed the fortunes of North Carolinians very markedly. It changed the success of the Republicans, and eventually will drive them out of power. And it now has its national counterpart in the Poor People's Movement. And I'm among those who would say that Reverend Barber is the modern equivalent of Dr. King, and North Carolinians are proud of him in potent ways.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I won't claim to be unbiased, that I think we can be proud to have made national news for, as opposed to some of the other things that you've mentioned that we've also made national news for in the state. And this is my adopted home, but I've been here for some time, and I'm happy to be, and so I appreciate those efforts, because from North Carolinians. For sure.
Too, just to recall, one of the great highlights of the Moral Monday movement was 100,000 people on the steps of the State House for HK on J. But not long before that, there had been 10,000 people assembled in Asheville for the Moral Monday protests. I remember that. And even more astonishing to me, 1,600 people in Burlington, North Carolina. I thought that was the highlight of the Moral Monday movement. Anybody could get 1,600 people in Burlington, North Carolina, Alamance County. You're doing some work. So we have, I think North Carolina's taught the country a lot about the power of engaged citizens.
Well, and I think we just have a couple of minutes left, and I think that's actually a nice segue to any final thoughts from both of you. And if I will just ask specifically if you have any other sort of recommendations for folks who really want to help, make progress in North Carolina specifically towards, greater justice for folks.
Well, I am a politician, so I am going to ask everyone not only to get out and vote, but to be sure to vote the entire ballot. It is so important. We have an opportunity, if we just get it done, to take back the General Assembly this year. And that would be huge, given that we've got, this is a census year, we will be redistricting in another year or two. We also, there are 3 seats on the Supreme Court, and is it 4 on the Court of Appeals? To keep those in progressive hands, I think would do a lot towards restoring North Carolina as that, progressive beacon in the South that values education as a way to lift people out of poverty. So that's my 2 cents.
Let me just echo that, particularly about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in North Carolina is going to play a strong role, not only now and in protecting the democracy in North Carolina, like they're doing with regard to political gerrymandering, but the United States Supreme Court is undergoing a sea change, and it's going to be a brutal and costly one. It's going to mean that we lose rights that have long been safeguarded, including, of course, the right to choose and the right to be free from discrimination based on sexual orientation and the like. We will depend in North Carolina on those rights being assured by our own state Supreme Court, which now we know would do that, would undertake the task. But if we lose seats on the North Carolina Supreme Court, our own individual liberties are literally in jeopardy. It is crucial, of course, to retain the governor, because I spend a lot of time in low-income communities in North Carolina, and it's disheartening to think the entirety of your government has you in its sights. And with a Democratic governor, that is relieved. But most of all, Democrats are required to win the State House. They have to win both houses. This sounds exaggerated, but it's not. Our form of government, our commitment to democracy, our belief in equality and in the rule of law is literally on the ballot. And we cannot afford another 4 years of a legislature that is directly at odds with our fundamental values. So I wish that it wasn't as crucial as it was. I wish we weren't in a fight for our own dignity and way of life, but it is what it is. So if there's ever been a time, literally, for all persons on deck, this is it. Right now, the next 2.5 weeks, right, Terry? All is at stake, both in Washington and in Raleigh.
Well, thank you for that rousing call. And early voting is through the end of October. As I've said before, and as we've been saying,
Lieutenant Governor, just got to get a plug in for that. Lieutenant Governor could be the tie-breaking vote. Yvonne Holly is a great candidate.
Absolutely. And I do want to say, and I could talk all night, but we're gonna end here because it's 8:02. But I do want to say that I think being specific about the idea that it's not just political, but we're talking about a certain ethical component, right? About what's happening. And I, for one, and I think other people would as well, long for the time when those basic sort of norms and ethics can be assumed from people in both parties. Mm-hmm. And that's a goal, not so much that, that anyone wants to just get rid of, any competition, right? You spoke to that earlier, but just something that is not what we have now, where we don't have those same assumptions
Well said.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming this evening. Professor Gene Nichol, thank you so much for your work on the book, Indecent Assembly. Senator Terry Van Duyn, thank you so much for your service in the General Assembly and for joining us this evening. And to everyone who's joined us, thank you so much for spending time with us and for all of your support. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Meanwhile, please stay safe and well. Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks for being here.